Have you ever packed your dreams into 2 suitcases, landed in America with broken English and a breaking heart, worked jobs that made you question your worth, fallen in love across cultures, fought through papers, pressure, and loneliness, only to wake up one ordinary morning and whisper, "This is home"? Stay with me, because this is the real story of when I finally knew America was my home. The question that changed me. What if the moment you almost gave up was actually the moment you were closest to belonging? I came to America with 2 suitcases, uncertain English, and a heart full of quiet fear. I worked, I struggled, I fell in love, I doubted myself, and somewhere between loneliness and late-night courage, I whispered 3 simple words, "This is home." This is the story of how that happened. When did America become my home? Not the day my visa was approved. Not the first day at work. Not even the day I learned how to understand fast American conversations without subtitles. The answer is softer than that. And maybe, as you listen, you will recognize your own turning point too. The airplane landed, and everything felt cinematic for about 10 minutes. Bright lights. Big airport. Different accents. Then reality arrived. I stood outside the terminal, holding my phone, pretending to look busy because I was afraid to speak. People around me spoke quickly, confidently, effortlessly. I understood words, but not the rhythm. English in textbooks is polite and slow. English in real life moves like traffic in New York, fast and slightly aggressive. In those first days, I didn't struggle with vocabulary. I struggled with confidence. Neuroscience explains this in a simple way. When we feel judged or out of place, the brain activates its stress response. The amygdala sends a quiet alarm, "Be careful." Blood flows away from the logical thinking center and into survival mode. That's why your mind goes blank when someone asks you a simple question. It's not because you are stupid. It's because your brain thinks you are under threat. And being new in America feels like a small, constant threat. New systems. New culture. New expectations. I rented a small room. The heater made strange noises at night. Outside, everything looked organized and calm. Inside, my thoughts were loud. I practiced basic sentences in front of the mirror. My name is. I am looking for. Could you please say that again? The sentences were simple, almost childish. But repetition builds neural pathways. The brain loves patterns. The more you repeat something in a low-stress environment, the easier it becomes under pressure. So I kept practicing. Not because I felt confident, but because I wanted to build familiarity. One afternoon, I went to a grocery store alone. That trip felt more stressful than the flight across the ocean. I picked up items carefully, double-checking prices. At the cashier, she asked me something I didn't catch. I froze. She repeated it. My heart started racing. Then I realized she said, "Paper or plastic?" Such a small question. But in that moment, it felt like a language exam. "Paper, please," I answered. She nodded. "You got it." That was it. No applause. No dramatic music. But I walked out of the store with a quiet victory inside me. Confidence doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with tiny wins. At night, loneliness visited like an uninvited guest. America is busy. People work hard. They respect personal space. No one automatically checks on you. Back home, noise filled the air, family, neighbors, familiar smells. Here, silence had a different weight. There is a psychological concept called belonging uncertainty. When we enter a new environment, we constantly ask ourselves, do I fit here? If the answer feels unclear, motivation drops. That's when many people stop trying, especially with English. They think, maybe this is not for me. I had those thoughts too. I would watch American shows with subtitles and understand only half of the dialogue. I would replay scenes again and again. But something interesting happened. I began to understand tone before vocabulary. I could hear when someone was joking, even if I missed the joke. I could feel frustration, kindness, sarcasm. Language is not only grammar. It is emotion carried by sound. Slowly, I changed my goal. Instead of saying, I want perfect English, I said, I want real conversations. That shift reduced pressure. Research shows that when goals are realistic and process-focused, the brain releases more dopamine, the motivation chemical. Big, abstract goals create anxiety. Small, daily actions create progress. So I made a rule for myself. Every day, one real sentence to a real person. Good morning. Thank you. Have a nice day. It sounds simple. It was simple. But it changed everything. Something else was changing too. My identity. Back home, I was confident. I knew cultural jokes. I understood unspoken rules. In America, I became the one with an accent. That label felt heavy at first. But over time, I realized something powerful. An accent is proof of courage. It means you dared to cross borders. The question, when did America become my home, stayed with me like a quiet echo. At that time, I didn't know the answer yet. I only knew this: I had stopped running from discomfort. I had stopped comparing myself to native speakers. I had started participating, even imperfectly. Home is not a place where everything is easy. It is a place where you allow yourself to grow without apology. And without realizing it, growth had already begun. Arriving with 2 suitcases. 2 suitcases. That was the physical size of my new life when I arrived in America. One suitcase had clothes. The other carried documents, photos from home, and a quiet belief that something better was waiting on the other side of uncertainty. At the airport, everything felt large, large buildings, large voices, large possibilities. But inside me, everything felt very small. The first lesson America teaches you is this: dreams are exciting at the beginning, but daily life is where the real story happens. My first morning in the United States was strangely quiet. No dramatic music. No big movie moment. Just sunlight coming through a window in a small rented room. The heater clicked on and off. Outside, cars moved steadily like they all knew exactly where they were going. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought one simple sentence in English: okay, this is real. Many people imagine that moving to America feels powerful. Sometimes it does. But more often, it feels confusing. Your brain is trying to process thousands of unfamiliar details at the same time: new street signs, different food labels, unfamiliar social rules. Cognitive scientists call this cultural load. Your brain works harder when everything around you is new. Even simple tasks require more mental energy. Buying groceries. Using public transportation. Understanding small talk. This is why many immigrants feel tired even when they haven't done much physically. Your brain is doing invisible work all day long. During my first week, I walked through neighborhoods just to observe. American houses looked different from what I was used to. Front lawns were carefully trimmed. Mailboxes stood near the road like quiet little guards. In the distance, children rode bicycles while parents watched from porches. It looked peaceful. Almost too peaceful. Back home, life was louder. Conversations happened everywhere. Neighbors talked across balconies. Street food smelled like spices and history. In America, life seemed organized, calm, and slightly distant. That distance can feel lonely if you are not prepared for it. One afternoon, I sat in a small cafe trying to order coffee. The barista smiled and asked a question that sounded like one long word. My brain caught only two sounds, drink and size. I hesitated for half a second too long, and suddenly there were people waiting behind me. Pressure makes language harder. Psychologists know this well. When we feel judged by others, our brain shifts into performance anxiety mode. Working memory, the system that helps you form sentences, gets overloaded. That's why even advanced English learners sometimes forget simple words when speaking. I pointed at the menu and said slowly, "Small coffee, please." The barista nodded. You got it. That phrase became familiar to me. Americans say you got it often. It means no problem, or I understand. Simple expressions like that became my daily vocabulary. Language learning experts often say something important. Real language grows from real situations. Not from memorizing long word lists, but from interacting with people. And those interactions began shaping my life in quiet ways. My first job in America was not glamorous. It was practical. Like many immigrants, I started with work that required effort more than perfect language skills. The schedule was strict. The expectations were clear. Arrive on time. Do your job well. Respect the system. American work culture values reliability. Showing up consistently builds trust faster than speaking perfect English. At work, I listened more than I spoke. Listening became my secret classroom. I paid attention to how coworkers greeted each other. Morning. How's it going? Not bad. Short sentences. Relaxed tone. I realized something surprising. Everyday English in America is simple. People rarely speak in complicated textbook sentences. The complexity comes from speed, not vocabulary. So I began training my ear. Instead of trying to understand every word, I listened for patterns. Tone. Rhythm. Repeated phrases. Neuroscience supports this approach. The brain recognizes patterns faster than it memorizes isolated information. When you hear the same phrases many times, your brain stores them as chunks rather than separate words. For example, how's it going? Pretty good. See you tomorrow. These small pieces of language slowly became automatic for me. But outside of work, evenings were still difficult. Loneliness is a silent teacher. It forces you to sit with your thoughts longer than you want. I often cooked simple meals and watched American shows with subtitles. Sometimes I paused scenes and repeated sentences aloud. Nice to meet you. That makes sense. I appreciate it. At first, it felt awkward speaking to a television screen. But repetition builds muscle memory in speech. Just like practicing a musical instrument. Weeks passed. My English improved slowly, not dramatically, but steadily. More importantly, my fear began shrinking. Fear thrives in unfamiliar territory. The more experiences you collect, the smaller that fear becomes. Still, a question quietly followed me everywhere. What am I really building here? At that time, America still felt like a place I lived in, not a place I belonged to. I was learning systems, learning language, learning routines. But belonging is something deeper than survival. Belonging usually arrives through people. And I had no idea that soon, unexpectedly, one conversation would begin changing everything. Working my first job. The first job you take in a new country rarely becomes your dream job. It becomes something more important, your training ground for reality. My first job in America did exactly that. It didn't make me rich. It didn't impress anyone back home. But it quietly began shaping the life I would eventually build. The building where I worked was not glamorous. Bright lights, simple equipment, the low hum of machines in the background. People moved with purpose. Everyone seemed to understand the rhythm of the place except me. On my first day, I watched carefully, like a student studying a new language, but this time the language was behavior. American workplaces have an interesting culture. They are friendly, but structured. People might say "How's it going?" with a smile, but they also expect efficiency. Conversations are short. Time is respected. And one thing becomes clear very quickly. Reliability matters more than perfection. My English was still slow at that time. When coworkers spoke quickly, I understood about 60% of what they said. Sometimes 70 on a good day. My brain was constantly working like a translator with a slight delay. But something unexpected helped me improve faster than any textbook: repetition. Every morning, someone would say, "Morning." I would reply, "Morning." Later someone might say, "See you tomorrow." I would answer, "See you." These exchanges were tiny, almost invisible moments. Yet language scientists explain that repetition in real context strengthens neural connections in the brain. The more frequently you hear and use a phrase, the faster your brain retrieves it. Think of it like building a road in your mind. The first time, the path is narrow. After many uses, it becomes a highway. At work, I listened more than I talked. Listening is often underestimated in language learning. But the brain absorbs rhythm and tone long before it masters grammar. I noticed how Americans shorten words in casual speech. Going to becomes gonna. Want to becomes wanna. Let me becomes lemme. At first it sounded like a completely different language. But slowly, my ears adapted. One afternoon, during a break, a coworker sat next to me. His name was Mark. He opened his lunch and looked over with a friendly expression. "So, where are you from?" A simple question. But it carried many layers. People often ask it with curiosity, not judgment. Still, answering it always made me slightly nervous. My accent suddenly felt louder when I spoke about my background. I'm from overseas, I said carefully, naming my country. Mark nodded with interest. That's cool. Must be a big change living here. That sentence stayed in my mind. Not because it was complex, but because it was kind. Many people worry about being judged when speaking imperfect English. But most Americans care more about the story behind your words than the grammar inside them. Psychologists call this the spotlight effect. We believe others notice our mistakes much more than they actually do. In reality, people are usually focused on their own lives. That realization reduced my anxiety. If people weren't analyzing my English as closely as I imagined, maybe I didn't need to be so hard on myself either. Workdays developed a steady rhythm. Clock in. Complete tasks. Short conversations. Clock out. Some days were tiring, but there was satisfaction in building a routine. Routine creates stability, and stability gives the brain a sense of safety. Safety is important for learning. Research shows that when people feel secure in their environment, the brain becomes more open to absorbing new information. Stress blocks learning. Stability encourages it. Gradually, I noticed something surprising. My coworkers started talking to me more often. Not long conversations, just small interactions. Busy today, huh? Yeah, a little. You heading out? Yep, see you tomorrow. These simple exchanges might sound insignificant, but they marked a shift. I was no longer just the quiet new person. I was part of the daily environment. Still, evenings remained quiet. After work, I often walked home slowly, observing the neighborhood. American streets at sunset have a calm feeling. The sky stretches wide, sometimes painted in orange and purple. Cars pass occasionally, but the pace of life slows down. During those walks, I thought about my decision to move here. Doubt sometimes appeared like a shadow. Was I building something meaningful, or simply surviving? The human brain naturally questions big life changes. When we move far from familiar environments, our identity enters a period of reconstruction. Who am I here? What is my role in this new society? These questions do not get answered quickly. They unfold over time. But one important thing had already changed. I was no longer afraid to speak simple English. My sentences were short, but they were real. Communication had begun replacing silence. Looking back now, that first job gave me more than a paycheck. It gave me exposure to everyday American life. It taught me how people communicate, how workplaces function, how routines shape culture. And somewhere in those ordinary days, between short conversations and quiet walks home, the first small pieces of belonging were forming. I didn't notice it at the time. But the journey toward calling America home had already started. Loneliness in a crowded country. America is a busy place. Cities are full. Highways are full. Restaurants are full. Yet somehow, loneliness can still find you very easily here. That realization came to me slowly. During the day, life felt structured. Work gave me a schedule. Coworkers gave me small conversations. But evenings were different. When I returned to my small room after work, the quiet felt heavier than before. Outside, the street lights turned on. Cars passed by occasionally. Inside, there was only the sound of the heater and my own thoughts. Loneliness in a new country is not dramatic. It's subtle. It appears in small moments, when you cook dinner alone, when you scroll through old photos from home, when you hear people laughing somewhere nearby and realize you are not part of that circle. Psychologists describe this experience with an interesting concept: social belonging. Humans are wired to feel safe when they are part of a group. When that connection is missing, the brain reacts almost like it is experiencing physical discomfort. That's why loneliness can feel so exhausting even if your day was not physically difficult. One evening, I sat by the window watching people walk their dogs along the sidewalk. They talked casually with neighbors. Someone laughed loudly. It looked simple, natural. And I remember thinking quietly, how long will it take before I feel like I belong here too? That question stayed with me. Many immigrants experience the same emotional phase. At first, everything is exciting. Then reality settles in, and the emotional gap between the old life and the new one becomes clear. Your friends are far away. Your family is in a different time zone. Even humor feels different. Sometimes I would receive messages from home saying, "You're lucky to live in America." And in many ways, that was true. Opportunities existed here. Safety, stability, possibility. But luck does not erase loneliness. What helped me survive those quiet nights was something very simple: routine. Routine gives structure to uncertain lives. After dinner, I started dedicating time to listening practice. Not intense studying, just listening slowly and consistently. I watched short American videos online. I replayed small conversations. I listened to how people spoke naturally. Instead of trying to memorize grammar rules, I focused on understanding emotions behind words. For example, Americans often say "that's interesting." But the meaning changes depending on tone. Sometimes it means genuine curiosity. Other times it politely means, "I don't agree, but I won't argue." Language is full of these subtle signals. Research in linguistics shows that more than 70% of communication comes from tone, rhythm, and context, not just vocabulary. That discovery helped me relax. I didn't need to understand every word to understand the message. Another habit I developed was reading simple English stories aloud. Slowly. Quietly. My goal was not speed, it was clarity. When you read aloud, your brain connects 3 systems at the same time: listening, speaking, and memory. This method is surprisingly powerful. Studies in cognitive science show that speaking words out loud activates additional neural pathways compared to silent reading. In simple terms, your brain learns faster when it hears your own voice practicing. At first, I felt a little silly talking to myself in a quiet room. But over time, those moments became comforting. My English voice slowly became more natural. Still, emotional loneliness cannot be solved by language practice alone. Humans need connection. And connection often begins with small interactions. One night, while buying groceries after work, the cashier recognized me. I had been to that store several times already. She smiled and said, "Hey, you're back again." That sentence surprised me. It meant she remembered me. Yeah, I said, smiling slightly. I live nearby. Well, welcome back, she replied warmly. That conversation lasted maybe 10 seconds. But something inside me shifted. Familiarity had appeared. Someone recognized my presence in this big country. Belonging rarely arrives through dramatic events. It grows from repeated small encounters. Another thing helped me during those months, walking. Long walks through neighborhoods, parks, and quiet streets. Walking gives your mind space to process emotions. Neuroscience research shows that moderate movement increases blood flow to the brain and improves mood. During those walks, I began noticing details about American life I had missed before. Families grilling in their backyards. Kids playing basketball in driveways. Couples walking dogs at sunset. Life here wasn't cold or distant. It was simply organized differently. Back home, social life happened spontaneously. In America, social life often requires planning. People schedule dinners, meetings, visits. Once I understood that cultural difference, things started making more sense. Loneliness slowly became less heavy. Then something unexpected happened at work one afternoon. A coworker invited me to join a small group for lunch. It was not a big event. Just a simple invitation. But invitations have power. They open doors. And that small moment would lead to conversations that changed my life in ways I never expected. Because sometimes, the path toward feeling at home begins with something as simple as sitting at the same lunch table. A lunch table conversation. Some turning points in life arrive quietly. No dramatic music, no flashing lights, just a simple moment that changes the direction of your story. For me, one of those moments began with a lunch table. It happened on a normal weekday. The kind of day that looks identical to every other workday. I was finishing a task when Mark, the coworker who had once asked where I was from, walked by and said casually, "Hey, a few of us are grabbing lunch. You wanna come?" That sentence might sound ordinary. But for someone who had been spending most lunches alone, it felt like a door opening. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound relaxed. "Sure." We walked to a small diner not far from the workplace. American diners have a very particular atmosphere, comfortable, slightly noisy, full of the smell of coffee and grilled food. The menu was large. Too large. But I had already learned a useful strategy for moments like this. When unsure, keep it simple. "I'll have a sandwich," I told the waitress. The group at the table talked about many things: weekend plans, sports, traffic, work stories. At first, I mostly listened. Listening had become my survival skill. But something interesting happens when you spend enough time around people. You start understanding not just their words, but their rhythm. The conversation flowed quickly, but I began catching pieces. Crazy weather this week. My kids' soccer game. That new movie everyone's talking about. It felt like standing near a fast-moving river. At first, the current seems impossible to enter. But eventually, you realize there are calmer places along the edge where you can step in. Mark turned toward me again. "So what do you usually do on weekends?" The table became slightly quieter. Not silent, just attentive. My brain quickly organized a sentence. "I usually explore the city, I said slowly. I like walking and discovering new places. Nice, someone said. That's the best way to learn a city. That moment taught me something powerful about communication. You don't need long speeches to connect with people. Simple honesty works surprisingly well. Social psychologists often explain that humans bond through shared experiences, not perfect language. When people hear something relatable, like enjoying a walk or exploring a neighborhood, they respond emotionally, not grammatically. The lunch continued. People laughed. Stories were exchanged. I didn't speak much, but when I did, nobody seemed impatient about my accent or my slower sentences. In fact, something unexpected happened. They asked more questions. Have you tried barbecue yet? Do you like American coffee? What's the biggest difference you notice living here? These questions were not difficult English exercises. They were curiosity. And curiosity is the beginning of connection. One question made everyone laugh. Someone asked, "So what surprised you the most about America?" I thought for a moment. The refrigerators, I said. Everyone looked confused for half a second. They are huge, I added, smiling. Back home they are much smaller. The table exploded with laughter. Not because the comment was funny in a clever way, but because it was true. Cultural differences often reveal themselves in everyday objects. That moment relaxed me. Humor had entered the conversation. Humor is a powerful social signal. When people laugh together, the brain releases oxytocin, the hormone connected with trust and bonding. In other words, laughter makes strangers feel more like friends. After lunch, as we walked back to work, I felt lighter. Something subtle had changed. I was no longer just observing American life from the outside. I had stepped into it, even if only slightly. That afternoon, my English also felt easier. Not perfect, but more natural. This is another interesting psychological effect. When we feel socially accepted, the brain reduces its stress signals. Less stress means better language performance. Confidence does not appear before action. It appears after repeated experiences of surviving social situations. That lunch became a new starting point. Over the following weeks, occasional invitations continued. Coffee breaks. Short conversations in the hallway. Small jokes. Each interaction built familiarity. Familiarity slowly transforms strangers into community. But the most unexpected change had not happened yet. Because among those casual conversations and ordinary workdays, there was one person whose presence would begin shaping a completely different chapter of my life. At that time, I didn't know it yet. But the story of how America became my home was about to include something much deeper than language learning or cultural adaptation. It was about to include love. The day I met her. Life has an unusual sense of timing. Sometimes the most important people enter your story when you are not looking for anything special at all. That's exactly how it happened for me. It was another ordinary afternoon at work. Machines hummed softly, people moved through their routines, and the day felt predictable. I was finishing a task when someone new walked into the workspace with a supervisor. "This is Emily," the supervisor said. "She's joining the team." Emily smiled politely at everyone. Nothing dramatic. Just a calm, friendly expression. But there was something about the way she looked at people when they spoke, fully attentive, genuinely interested. When the supervisor introduced us, I nodded slightly. "Hi," I said. "Hi," she replied. Simple. 2 small words. Yet that moment became the first page of a completely new chapter. Over the next few days, Emily and I occasionally worked in the same area. Our conversations were short at first, mostly practical things. "Could you pass that?" "Sure." "Thanks." "No problem." The rhythm felt easy. Emily spoke clearly, not too fast. That alone made communication comfortable for me. Many native speakers unconsciously slow down when talking to someone learning the language. It's a subtle act of kindness. One afternoon during a break, she sat at the same table where I was drinking coffee. For a moment we both checked our phones. Then she looked up and asked the familiar question I had heard many times before. "So, where are you from?" But something about the way she asked felt different. It wasn't just curiosity, it felt like genuine interest. I told her briefly about my home country and how long I had been in America. She listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding. "That must have been a big change," she said. I laughed slightly. "Yes, everything is different." She smiled. "What's the hardest part?" That question made me pause. Many people ask about the exciting parts of moving to America. Very few ask about the difficult parts. I thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes, it's lonely," I said honestly. Emily didn't react with awkward sympathy. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense," she said. "Moving anywhere new can feel like that." Her response surprised me. She didn't treat my experience as unusual or dramatic. She treated it as something normal and understandable. Psychologists often say that feeling understood is one of the strongest foundations of human connection. When someone listens without judgment, the brain interprets that moment as emotional safety. And emotional safety creates openness. Over the next weeks, our conversations slowly became longer. Still simple, still casual, but more personal. She told me about growing up in a small American town. About family road trips. About learning to drive at 16. I shared stories about my childhood, the culture I grew up in, the foods I missed from home. Sometimes we laughed about cultural differences. For example, I told her how confusing American tipping culture was when I first arrived. In my first week, I said, "I didn't know you should tip in restaurants." Emily laughed. "Yeah, that's a big one." Later my friend explained it to me, I continued. I felt terrible. She smiled kindly. "Don't worry. Everyone learns those things over time." These conversations were not deep philosophical debates. They were simple exchanges about everyday life. But something important was happening underneath. Trust was growing. Language experts often say that emotional connection accelerates language learning. When conversations involve real feelings, the brain becomes more engaged. You remember words better because they are linked to meaningful experiences. Talking with Emily felt different from practicing English in front of a mirror. It felt natural. One day after work, we walked outside at the same time. The evening sky was turning orange, the air slightly cooler. "Do you ever explore the city?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I like walking around. It helps me learn the place." "That's a good idea," she replied. "There's a park not far from here. It's really nice at sunset." That simple recommendation turned into our first walk together a few days later. The park was quiet. Trees moved gently in the wind. People jogged along the paths, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked happily. We walked slowly, talking about random things. Music. Movies. Childhood memories. My English wasn't perfect, but something had changed. I wasn't thinking about grammar anymore. I was just speaking. And that's when language becomes alive. At one point we sat on a bench watching the sky grow darker. Street lights flickered on one by one. Emily looked around and said something simple. "I like this city." I nodded. "Me too." But in my mind, another thought quietly appeared. Maybe America wasn't just becoming a place where I worked and lived. Maybe it was slowly becoming a place where I connected, where I laughed, where I shared pieces of my life. And without realizing it, those small moments with Emily were beginning to change the answer to the question that had followed me since the day I arrived. When did America start feeling like home? The answer was getting closer. Love between two cultures. At first, Emily and I were simply two co-workers who enjoyed talking during breaks. Then we became two friends who occasionally walked through parks after work. Somewhere along the way, something shifted, so quietly that neither of us noticed the exact moment it happened. But one evening made it impossible to ignore. It was early autumn. The air had started turning cooler, and the trees were slowly changing color. Red, orange, and gold leaves covered the sidewalks. For someone who grew up in a tropical climate, American autumn felt almost magical. Emily and I were walking through the same park where we had talked many times before. Children were playing near the fountain, and a man nearby was practicing guitar softly. "Autumn is my favorite season," Emily said, looking up at the trees. "It's beautiful," I replied. "In my country we don't have seasons like this." She looked curious. "Really?" "Mostly warm all year," I explained. "No leaves changing color." She smiled slightly. "Then you picked the perfect place to experience it." That sentence stayed in the air for a moment. Something about the calm atmosphere, the fading sunlight, and the easy conversation created a quiet emotional closeness. It was comfortable. Natural. The kind of connection that doesn't need to explain itself. Psychologists sometimes describe this feeling as emotional synchronization. When two people share similar rhythms of conversation, body language, and attention, the brain begins releasing chemicals that create feelings of trust and attraction. In simple terms, humans connect deeply when they feel understood. Our conversations had grown beyond basic topics. Emily asked thoughtful questions about my culture, my family, and what life was like before I moved to America. I asked her about her childhood, her dreams, and the small traditions she grew up with. One conversation made us both laugh. Emily asked, "What confused you the most when you first arrived in the U.S.?" I thought for a moment. "Drive through everything," I said. She laughed immediately. "You mean fast food?" Yes, but not just food, I said. Drive-through coffee, drive-through pharmacy. I even saw a drive-through bank. Emily laughed again. Yeah. Americans really love staying in their cars. Moments like that made cultural differences feel fun rather than intimidating. Instead of being barriers, they became topics we enjoyed exploring together. But love between two cultures also carries quiet questions. Could our different backgrounds create challenges later? Would our families understand? Would our values align? These thoughts didn't appear as fear. They appeared as careful curiosity. One evening while walking near the river downtown, Emily asked something that felt more serious. Do you ever miss home? She said gently. I looked at the water reflecting city lights. Yes, I answered honestly. Sometimes a lot. What do you miss the most? My family, I said. And the feeling of knowing exactly where I belong. Emily nodded slowly. She didn't rush to fill the silence. That was one of the things I appreciated most about her. She allowed conversations to breathe. Then she said something simple but meaningful. Belonging can grow in new places too. That sentence lingered in my mind long after that night. Love stories often look dramatic in movies. Big gestures. Intense declarations. But in real life, love usually grows through quiet consistency. Shared walks. Honest conversations. Small acts of kindness. Over the following months, Emily and I spent more time together. Weekend coffee. Exploring neighborhoods. Trying different restaurants. During those moments, my English improved naturally. Not because I was studying, but because I was living inside real conversations. Language experts often say that emotional engagement is one of the most powerful tools for language acquisition. When you care about the conversation, your brain works harder to express ideas and understand responses. I noticed something interesting. My sentences were becoming longer without conscious effort. My vocabulary expanded simply because new experiences required new words. One afternoon Emily joked, "Your English is getting really good." I laughed. "It's because I practice with you." She smiled. "Then I'm glad to help." Eventually, the truth we both felt became impossible to ignore. We weren't just friends anymore. Our relationship had grown into something deeper, a partnership built on curiosity, respect, and shared discovery. But relationships also bring new responsibilities. Building a life together requires more than affection. It requires patience, communication, and the willingness to navigate challenges that neither person expected. And as beautiful as our connection felt, the next chapter of our story would test us in ways we hadn't yet imagined. Because love across cultures can be powerful. But it also asks both people one important question. Are you ready to build a life that blends two different worlds? The answer to that question would slowly shape the future we were about to create together. Building a life together. Love feels exciting at the beginning. Everything is new. Every conversation feels meaningful. Every shared moment feels special. But real relationships eventually move beyond the excitement stage and enter something deeper, building a life together. Emily and I reached that point gradually. At first, our time together was simple: coffee shops, weekend walks, small road trips to nearby towns. We enjoyed discovering things about each other's worlds. I introduced her to foods from my culture. She showed me classic American traditions like Thanksgiving dinners and small-town festivals. One evening, I visited her parents' home for the first time. If you've ever met your partner's family in a different culture, you know the feeling. Your brain suddenly becomes very alert. Every word matters. Every gesture feels important. Her parents welcomed me warmly at the door. "Nice to finally meet you," her father said, shaking my hand. Her mother smiled kindly. "Emily has told us a lot about you." Those words eased my nervousness slightly. Dinner conversations moved slowly at first. They asked about my background, my work, and what I liked about living in America. I answered carefully but honestly. At one point her father asked a question that made me pause. "What made you decide to build your life here?" It was a big question. Bigger than the room we were sitting in. I thought for a moment before answering. "Opportunity," I said. But also, curiosity. I wanted to see what life could become if I tried something difficult. He nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good reason." Moments like that matter more than people realize. Families want to understand the person who is becoming part of their child's life. When they see sincerity, they usually respond with respect. Psychologists often explain that acceptance grows from shared values, not shared backgrounds. Two families can come from completely different cultures and still connect if they recognize similar principles: hard work, honesty, kindness. That evening ended with laughter and homemade dessert. When Emily and I drove home, the road was quiet. "Well," she said with a small smile, "you survived." I laughed. "I think it went well." She nodded. "They like you." Those simple words meant a lot. As our relationship grew stronger, practical conversations started appearing. Where would we live? What kind of future did we want? How would we combine two cultures into one life? These discussions weren't always easy. Cultural differences sometimes showed up in unexpected ways. For example, in my culture, family gatherings are often spontaneous and frequent. In Emily's world, social events were usually planned in advance. At first, this confused me. Why do people schedule dinner 2 weeks ahead? I once asked jokingly. Emily laughed. That's just how life works here. Instead of becoming frustrated, we treated these differences like puzzles to solve together. Communication became our most important skill. One habit helped us a lot: explaining the meaning behind traditions. Instead of saying "this is how it should be," we asked, "Why does this matter to you?" Understanding the emotional reasons behind cultural habits made compromise easier. Another important conversation eventually arrived: the topic of marriage. We didn't rush into it. Real partnerships require time to mature. But after months of shared experiences, the idea naturally appeared in our discussions about the future. One evening we were walking near the same park bench where we had spent many earlier conversations. "I've been thinking," Emily said quietly. "About what?" I asked. "About the future." That phrase can make anyone slightly nervous. She continued gently. "I really like the life we're building together." I nodded slowly. "Me too." There was a pause. Then she asked a question that carried enormous meaning. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? That question appears often in job interviews. But in relationships, it means something much deeper. I looked around the park. The same trees. The same paths. The same quiet evening atmosphere. 5 years earlier, I hadn't even known this place existed. Now it held some of the most important memories of my life. I think, I said slowly, I see myself here. Emily smiled softly. And hopefully, I added, with you. Her smile widened. Life doesn't suddenly become perfect when two people decide to build a future together. Challenges still appear. Immigration paperwork, career decisions, financial responsibilities, all of those things require patience and teamwork. But something important had already changed inside me. America no longer felt like a temporary experiment. It felt like a place where my story was continuing to grow through relationships, experiences, and shared dreams. Still, one final realization had not yet arrived. The moment when I would truly understand the meaning of the words I had heard so many times since arriving here. Welcome home. That moment would come unexpectedly, during a quiet morning that looked completely ordinary. Papers, pressure, and patience. Anyone who has gone through the immigration process knows something most people never see from the outside. Building a life in a new country is not only about dreams and relationships. It is also about paperwork, waiting, uncertainty, and patience. A lot of patience. For a long time, my life seemed to move forward and pause at the same time. I had a job. I had people around me. I had a relationship that was becoming serious. But legally and emotionally, I still felt like I was standing on a bridge between two worlds. Immigration documents were always somewhere in the background of my life. Forms to fill out. Letters to collect. Deadlines to remember. Interviews to prepare for. Sometimes the process felt confusing. Sometimes it felt exhausting. There were nights when Emily and I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. Did we sign this one? She asked. I think so, I replied, flipping through another stack. Then we both laughed because the pile of documents seemed never-ending. But behind the laughter was real pressure. Immigration processes move slowly, and when your future depends on them, every delay feels heavier. Psychologists often talk about something called uncertainty stress, the anxiety people feel when they cannot clearly predict what will happen next. For immigrants, that stress can become part of everyday life. You continue working. You continue building relationships. But a small voice in your mind keeps asking the same question. What if something goes wrong? During one particularly stressful week, I remember sitting quietly after work, staring at my phone. Emily noticed. You're thinking about the paperwork again, she said gently. I nodded. It just feels like everything depends on it. She sat beside me and said something simple but powerful. We'll handle it together. Those 4 words changed the feeling in the room. One of the biggest differences between facing a problem alone and facing it with someone is emotional weight. The problem might be the same, but sharing responsibility makes it easier to breathe. We learn to focus on small progress instead of the entire process. Submit 1 form. Complete 1 interview. Wait for 1 update. Step by step. Life continued moving while we waited. We celebrated birthdays. We visited friends. We argued about small things like where to eat dinner. In other words, we lived normal life moments. And strangely, those ordinary moments were the ones that slowly changed my perspective. At the beginning of my journey, America felt like a test. I was constantly asking myself if I would succeed here. But during this waiting period, something different happened. Instead of asking, do I belong here, I started asking, how can I build a better life here? That shift may sound small, but internally it meant everything. Belonging is not always something you receive from a place. Sometimes it grows quietly through time, effort, and shared experiences. Then one afternoon, months later, an email notification appeared on my phone. At first, I didn't want to open it. Immigration emails had trained my brain to expect more waiting. But Emily looked at me and said, "Go ahead. Open it." I took a deep breath and tapped the screen. The message was short. Very short. But the meaning behind those few lines felt enormous. My status had been approved. For a few seconds I just stared at the phone. Emily leaned closer. "Well," she asked. I looked at her and finally smiled. "I think we're okay." She hugged me immediately. It wasn't a dramatic movie moment with fireworks or music. It was just two people standing in a small apartment kitchen, holding each other after a long period of uncertainty. But inside my mind, something quiet shifted. For the first time since arriving in America, the future stopped feeling temporary. It started feeling real. And yet, the moment when I truly realized this country had become my home still hadn't happened. Surprisingly, that realization would appear during the most ordinary morning imaginable. A moment so simple that I almost missed it. The moment I said, "This is home." The moment I realized America had become my home didn't arrive with fireworks, celebrations, or a big life milestone. It happened on a completely ordinary day. That morning began like many others. The alarm rang before sunrise, and for a few seconds I stayed still, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside. Years earlier, mornings like this used to feel heavy. Back then, waking up meant another day of proving myself, another day of struggling with language, work, paperwork, expectations, and the silent pressure of building a life from nothing. But something about that morning felt different. Not easier. Not perfect. Just lighter. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window while the sky slowly turned pale blue. The neighborhood was waking up, cars leaving driveways, a school bus stopping at the corner, someone jogging past the sidewalk. These were simple things, the kind of everyday moments people rarely notice. Yet for some reason, I noticed everything. Years ago, when I first arrived in the United States, nothing felt familiar. Every street sign looked confusing. Every conversation required courage. Even small tasks like ordering food or making a phone call could feel overwhelming. I remember the early days when I would replay conversations in my head, wondering if I had said something wrong. Sometimes I understood only half of what people said. Sometimes I smiled and nodded, hoping I hadn't misunderstood something important. Language was only one part of the challenge. There were long workdays that left my body exhausted and my mind full of doubt. There were moments when I questioned whether I belonged here at all. I missed the comfort of home, the language that flowed naturally, the people who understood me without explanation. And then there were the challenges in my marriage. Living between two cultures is not always easy. Expectations can be different. Communication can be harder than either person expects. Stress from work, immigration, and building stability sometimes turns small misunderstandings into big arguments. There were nights when we sat in silence, unsure how to fix what felt broken. At times, it felt like the American dream was testing every part of our relationship. But something else was happening during those difficult years. Slowly, without me noticing, life was changing. My English became more natural. Conversations that once felt terrifying started to feel normal. Work became more than just survival, it became responsibility, purpose, progress. Even our marriage began to evolve. We learned that love across cultures requires patience. It requires listening when things are uncomfortable. It requires choosing to stay during moments when leaving might seem easier. The struggles didn't disappear. But they began to teach us something deeper. One afternoon, months before that ordinary morning I mentioned earlier, I was driving home after work. Traffic was slow, the radio was playing quietly, and sunlight was stretching across the road ahead of me. I realized I wasn't thinking about how difficult life was anymore. Instead, I was thinking about small plans. What to cook for dinner. What we might do on the weekend. Whether we should visit a nearby park we hadn't explored yet. For the first time, my thoughts were not about surviving the present. They were about building the future. That realization stayed with me. Then came that quiet morning. After finishing my coffee, I stepped outside for a moment before leaving for work. The air was cool and the street was calm. A neighbor waved as they walked past with their dog. It was a simple gesture. But it felt natural. Not like I was a visitor. Not like I was someone passing through. Just a person living their life in a place that had slowly become familiar. As I stood there, something unexpected crossed my mind. I wasn't counting the years I had been in America anymore. I wasn't thinking about when I might leave. I wasn't comparing everything to the life I once had somewhere else. For the first time, my mind was quiet. And in that quiet moment, the words appeared gently in my thoughts. This is home. Not because everything was perfect. Not because every struggle had disappeared. But because I had grown here. This country had seen my uncertainty, my mistakes, my long workdays, my doubts, and my efforts to keep moving forward. It had witnessed the difficult chapters of my marriage and the healing that came afterward. It had watched me learn a new language, a new culture, and a new version of myself. Home, I realized, is not always where life begins. Sometimes home is the place where you fight through the hardest seasons of your life, and come out stronger on the other side. America became home not in one dramatic moment, but through thousands of small ones. Through early mornings and long shifts. Through conversations that slowly became easier. Through arguments that turned into understanding. Through ordinary days that quietly built a new life. Standing there that morning, watching the neighborhood wake up, I understood something clearly. The journey that once felt uncertain had already carried me somewhere meaningful. And without realizing it, I had stopped searching for home. Because somehow, along the way, I had already found it. The quiet realization. For a long time, I believed the moment of truly belonging would be dramatic. I imagined it might happen on a special day, maybe the day of a big achievement, a celebration, or some life-changing event that would clearly mark the turning point. I thought there would be a moment when everything suddenly made sense, when the struggles would disappear and life would finally feel complete. But the truth turned out to be much quieter. The realization that America had become home did not arrive with a big announcement. It arrived in silence. It happened one evening after work, on a day that looked completely ordinary from the outside. The sky was turning soft shades of orange and pink as the sun slowly moved toward the horizon. The air carried that calm feeling that comes at the end of a long day. People were heading home, finishing errands, cooking dinner, living their routines. I stepped outside for a few minutes just to breathe. After years of constant movement, working, planning, solving problems, worrying about the future, those few quiet minutes had become something valuable to me. They were moments when my mind could finally slow down. I leaned against the railing and watched the neighborhood. A child was riding a bicycle up and down the sidewalk. Across the street, someone was watering their plants. A car passed slowly by, music playing softly through the open window. Nothing about the scene was extraordinary. But something inside me began to shift. For years, my mind had always been somewhere else. Sometimes it was in the past, remembering the life I had left behind, the people I missed, the familiar places where everything once felt easy and natural. Other times my mind was in the future, thinking about what still needed to be fixed, improved, or achieved. Immigration paperwork, financial stability, career progress, relationship challenges. There was always another problem to solve, another step to take. But that evening was different. For the first time in a long time, my thoughts were not racing between the past and the future. They were simply present. I was just standing there, watching the world around me, feeling the quiet rhythm of an ordinary American neighborhood. And then a realization slowly appeared. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was almost like a gentle whisper in my own mind. Somewhere along this long journey, I had stopped feeling like a visitor. When I first came to the United States, everything felt temporary. Even when I tried to build a life here, part of my mind always treated it like a long stay in a foreign place. I told myself, let's see how things go. I told myself, maybe this will work out. I told myself, maybe one day life will finally feel stable. But standing there that evening, something was clear. Life was no longer a test. It was simply my life. The streets no longer looked unfamiliar. The language around me no longer felt like a puzzle I needed to solve. The routines of work, home, grocery stores, neighbors, and weekends had slowly built something steady. Without realizing it, I had created roots. And roots don't appear overnight. They grow quietly. They grow through difficult seasons. They grow through mistakes, disappointments, and moments when giving up might seem easier than continuing. America had seen me through those seasons. It had seen the early days when my confidence was fragile. It had seen the long work hours when success still felt far away. It had seen the challenges inside my marriage, the misunderstandings, the cultural differences, the moments when both of us wondered whether we were strong enough to keep going. But it had also seen something else. It had seen resilience. Little by little, we learned how to communicate better. We learned how to respect the differences in our backgrounds. We learned that love across cultures is not about perfection, it's about patience, forgiveness, and choosing each other again and again. And as those lessons slowly shaped our relationship, they also shaped me. I was no longer the same person who had first arrived with uncertainty and fear. The journey had changed me. It had made me more patient with challenges, more open to different perspectives, more aware of how strong people can become when they refuse to quit. Standing there that evening, watching the sky grow darker, I realized something important. Home is not always the place where life is easiest. Sometimes home is the place where life teaches you the most. The place where you struggle, learn, rebuild, and grow stronger than you ever expected. America had become that place for me. Not because it was perfect, but because it had become part of my story. And in that quiet evening moment, with the streetlights slowly turning on and the neighborhood settling into night, I felt something I had not felt during my early years here. Peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from having a perfect life, but the kind that comes from knowing you are exactly where your journey has led you. I looked around one more time before going back inside. The same street. The same houses. The same simple evening. Yet something inside me had finally settled. I wasn't measuring my life against another place anymore. I wasn't wondering where I truly belonged. Because the answer had already arrived quietly, without fanfare. After all the struggles, all the doubts, and all the years of building a life piece by piece, I had finally stopped searching for where home might be. And instead, I was simply living in it. Home was built slowly. The funny thing about finding a home is that it rarely happens in one dramatic moment. Movies love those big scenes. The music rises. The character looks around with tears in their eyes and finally declares, "This is where I belong." Everything becomes clear in one powerful second. Real life is quieter than that. Home, at least in my story, was built slowly. Not in grand milestones, but in ordinary mornings, long workdays, shared meals, small conversations, and thousands of tiny decisions to keep going when things were difficult. By the time I truly understood that America had become my home, the foundation had already been built. It had been built through years of adapting. Adapting to a new language. Adapting to a different rhythm of life. Adapting to a culture where independence is valued and people are always moving forward. When I first arrived, everything required extra effort. Even simple things like ordering food or asking for directions could feel stressful. I remember replaying conversations in my mind afterward, wondering if I had used the correct words. Learning English was not just about vocabulary. It was about confidence. Research in cognitive psychology shows that language learning is deeply connected to emotional safety. When people feel embarrassed or afraid of making mistakes, the brain becomes less willing to experiment with new words. But when the environment feels safe, when mistakes are allowed, the brain becomes curious again. That curiosity changed everything for me. Instead of trying to sound perfect, I focused on communication. Sometimes my sentences were simple. Sometimes my grammar was not perfect. But every conversation was a step forward. Little by little, English stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling like a bridge. A bridge to friendships. A bridge to professional opportunities. A bridge to understanding the culture around me. And culture, I learned, is not something you fully understand from books or news articles. Culture reveals itself in everyday moments. In the way neighbors greet each other. In the way people respect personal space. In the way strangers might hold the door open and say, "Have a nice day," even if they will never see you again. Those small interactions slowly changed my perspective. America is often described as a place of ambition and opportunity. And that is true. But it is also a place built by millions of personal stories. Stories of immigrants. Stories of families rebuilding their lives. Stories of people who arrived with little but slowly created something meaningful. Over time, my own story quietly joined that larger story. Work became more stable. Our marriage became stronger. We learned how to navigate cultural differences not as obstacles, but as strengths. My partner brought perspectives from growing up in America, while I brought experiences from a different world. Together, we built something that belonged to both of us. There were still challenges, of course. Life anywhere will always include uncertainty. But the difference was that uncertainty no longer felt frightening. It simply felt like part of the journey. Psychologists sometimes describe resilience as the ability to adapt while maintaining a sense of purpose. It is not about avoiding hardship. It is about continuing forward despite it. Looking back now, I realize that resilience quietly shaped every step of this journey. It was there during the early days of loneliness. It was there during the long work hours. It was there during the moments when I wondered if I was strong enough to build a life so far from the place where I began. Each of those moments added another small brick to the foundation of home. And eventually, without realizing it, the structure was complete. One day I woke up, drank my coffee, looked outside at the familiar streets, and understood something simple but powerful. I was no longer comparing my life here to somewhere else. This was simply my life. This was where my routines existed. This was where my memories were growing. This was where the future of my family was unfolding. And maybe that is the most honest definition of home. Home is not the place where everything is easy. Home is the place where your life continues to grow. For anyone watching this video while struggling with language learning, cultural change, or the feeling of being far away from where life once felt comfortable, I want to say something important. Progress often feels invisible while it is happening. The brain learns slowly. Confidence grows quietly. Belonging develops through repetition, not through dramatic breakthroughs. Every conversation you practice. Every new phrase you learn. Every moment when you choose not to give up. All of those moments are building something larger than you realize. Maybe you will not notice the change immediately. But one day, perhaps during a very ordinary evening, you will look around your life and feel something surprising. Comfort. Stability. A sense that the place around you has slowly become part of who you are. And in that quiet moment, you might smile and think the same simple sentence that once appeared in my mind. This is home. Thank you for spending this time with me, listening to this story, and practicing English through real-life experiences. Stories like this are not only about language learning, they are about human journeys, resilience, and hope. If this story helped you practice listening, reading, or speaking English even a little, then the time we shared here today was meaningful. Because language learning, like finding a home, is not about perfection. It is about continuing the journey. The strange thing about finding a home is that you often realize it long after it has already happened. One day you arrive in a new country with fear, broken English, and a heart full of questions. Years later, you look around during an ordinary moment, maybe while drinking coffee, walking through your neighborhood, or listening to quiet evening sounds, and suddenly understand something powerful. You didn't just move to America. You grew into it. Through language mistakes. Through long workdays. Through love, marriage, family, and the slow process of building a life. And somewhere between those small daily moments, America quietly became home. If this real English story helped you practice listening, reading, and speaking English, then remember something important. Language grows the same way a home is built, slowly, patiently, and one story at a time. More real stories about life in America, love, culture, family, and everyday English conversation are coming on this channel. So if you want to keep improving your real English listening practice, learning English through stories, and exploring what life in the United States really feels like, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who is also learning English. And in the next story, I will tell you about the moment when something unexpected happened in my life in America, a moment that completely changed the way I understood love, family, and belonging. You might see a piece of your own journey in that story too. I'll see you in the next video.